So Cobra Kai is a thing. It's a remake or reboot of the classic Karate Kid trilogy from the 80s. What's that? You didn't know that it was a trilogy? Oh yeah, they made three of those movies. And you know what? They're all pretty good. Except for that one where they made the villain in the third a little too over the top.
Hey, I like that! Oh, I like that, Johnny! I'm gonna use that!
I've talked about this before in the Dino Crisis video. Generally, I am against remaking anything unless there is a good reason to. And more money is not a good reason! I take issue when people remake something that already did well or is iconic on its own. The whole point of the Cinemasters podcast is to talk about how an okay movie could be made into something great with just a little extra thought. So why remake good things into crappy things? Well, I also have a video on DuckTales, and in that video I talked about how this new DuckTales takes the old formula of the original but reinterprets it into something new and different. Things were changed when the show was first adapted from the comic strip, and so again were things changed for this new show. The risks paid off, but even if they had not, at least risks were taken. But here's the thing, Cobra Kai doesn't try to remake or reinterpret the story of the Karate Kid. They tried that once. It was kinda goofy. I actually think this movie's pretty good, but would have worked better if it wasn't trying to adhere to the legacy of the Karate Kid. Cobra Kai is kind of nuts in its approach to the Karate Kid's past. It serves as the softest fucking reboot I have ever seen and is really more of a sequel than anything. And if you had told me back in 2018 that they were going to make a Karate Kid sequel with the next generation of teenage Karate Kids, I would have said that's a terrible idea. In fact, I will go on record saying that when I saw that pop up on YouTube, I said to myself, that's a terrible idea. But then I watched the damn thing and I knew I had to talk about it. But first I have to find a way to fit my foot into my mouth. Somehow, as a sequel, this show manages to be everything the 2010 movie couldn't be. This is because of the way the show deals with its characters and their actors, the way the story is presented to the audience, nostalgic storytelling, and how this all recontextualizes the original stories. And so today, I want to talk about Cobra Kai. The impetus for Cobra Kai began when William Zabka directed and starred in a comedic short film in 2007. In it, Zabka plays a parody of the character Johnny from The Karate Kid. The character asserts that Johnny was actually the hero and Daniel LaRusso was the villain of the film. This joke continued on between Zabka and the Karate Kid actor himself, Ralph Macchio, in public spaces and throughout pop culture. Eventually, three super Karate Kid fans named Josh Held, John Hurwitz, and Hayden Schlossberg pitched their idea for a show loosely based on that premise to several big-name streaming networks. But they chose to go with YouTube Red, the premium streaming service from the Google-owned YouTube. In 2018, the showrunners decided they wanted to switch things up and attempted to find another streaming service, but no deal was ever formulated. But when YouTube decided they were uninterested in pursuing a fourth season, the showrunners signed a deal with Netflix to release the third season with plans for a fourth. The first two seasons were made available on Netflix in August of 2020, and the third season was released on January 1st, 2021. It was the second most watched series on the streaming giant during that month, with Netflix's own Bridgerton as the first. If you're into that show, you can hear me talk about it over here. The show stars Ralph Macchio and William Zabka returning as Daniel and Johnny, with newcomers Xolo Maridueña, Mary Mouser, and Tanner Buchanan as the newer generation. They are also joined by many new talents and experienced returners. Massive spoilers for Cobra Kai. Not because I want to analyze it or deconstruct it, but simply because I want to spoil some things. Also, I want to analyze it. The basic premise returns us to Los Angeles, where Johnny Lawrence is now a washed-up laborer who gets fired from his job and then fucks up a couple of hoodlums from the local high school for touching his car. He decides to reopen the infamous Cobra Kai karate studio, where he can teach Miguel Diaz, his high school-age neighbor, the lessons he had been taught himself. Also because he's broke as shit. Daniel LaRusso finds out that Cobra Kai Studio is back and is outraged because of the brutality that Johnny's sensei had taught under that name. Meanwhile, Daniel feels as though he's lost the balance in his life and begins practicing karate again. Although his daughter does not seem interested in learning anymore, Daniel finds another willing student who turns out to be Johnny's estranged son. It sounds so soapy, and that's because it kind of is. And I could go on from there, but the important thing that you take away from this is that there are new characters in the next generation, but that also all of the old characters are played by their original actors. And they brought everybody back. Like, everybody. Over the course of the 3 seasons that are currently out, we've seen the return of Ali from the first movie, Chozen and Kumiko from The Karate Kid Part 2. That was a fucking trip to see them again. There was even an episode where they brought back all of Johnny's high school friends and did a whole reunion thing, which was incredible and a really good episode too. Plus, there's a lot of setup for other characters that are probably coming back in season 4. The showrunners have said that they have talked at length about any character that was featured in a Karate Kid movie that includes Mr. Miyagi, which means that they could— No, shut up. I don't want to talk about that one. I wonder if they've talked about bringing back BD Wong from his one cameo in the second movie. You know, Henry Wu from Jurassic Park. Bet you didn't know he was in Karate Kid. Right there.
Coming to the dance tonight. Oh, bring your friend.
What? They said any character, and he even has a line. That counts. Because all of the actors have come back and reprised their roles, there's a certain amount of credence to their characters. It makes this sequel meaningful rather than just another reboot. There is a large degree of believability to the stories being told because these characters look older rather than just being recast. And rather than explaining away characters, the showrunners take great pains to make sure that characters are all placed back into the universe believably. The only characters that do not make any return are those whose actors have passed away. This is important because the show's sense of continuity matches a lot of the real world continuity. So Sato and Yukie from the second movie are expressly said to have passed on because their actors have both passed on.
She left it to me after she passed, and I just don't have the heart to sell it.
This is of course most notable in the lack of Mr. Miyagi. People may complain about a lack of Asian actors in a show that deals so heavily with Eastern traditions and ideals, and that is a more than valid criticism to lay on this show. But the way the show deals with the legacy of Mr. Miyagi, and by extension the acting legacy of the great Pat Morita, is not without merit. These movies, particularly the first one, hold a lot of value for people, and to bring back the actors to play these characters years later and respect those who've passed on, while also introducing new characters with new stories of their own, makes the show's universe feel like it honors the history of what came before, while it tries to say something new by building off that legacy. So it's impossible to talk about this show without talking about nostalgia. The largest demographic that dictates what media is consumed and the direction that the zeitgeist flows in is now the millennial generation, and it has been for a while. This group has overwhelmingly defined media by their nostalgia. These are the kids that would have grown up seeing the Karate Kid movies. I myself fit in just at the end of this demographic. So if you're going to reboot anything, you have to ask the question, how much of this is good because we want it to be or because we just remember it being good, versus actually having an important story to tell. And Cobra Kai, which by the way is a way cooler name than the Karate Kid, understands this. Instead of distinguishing itself with a hokey twist like changing up who the main character is, or where they move to, the show instead embraces the nostalgia. Particularly with Johnny, who is constantly listening to 80s music and driving old cars. Even the way he talks is cringe-inducing because it's so offensive by today's standards, but was socially acceptable in the 80s.
You want all the girls to think you're a wangless dork?
In contrast, Daniel is constantly reminiscing about his time with Mr. Miyagi, when he felt things were simpler, or when his daughter was younger and she wanted to do karate with him. The show constantly shoves this in our face by having Johnny and Daniel repeatedly flash back to scenes from the movie, but then it points out the ridiculousness of this by showing what this kind of thinking does to us. More to the point, it points out why reboots fail. If you tell the same story over and over, you don't get anything new. This is the thesis of the show in regards to nostalgia, but also in regards to its own narrative storytelling. By contextualizing the nostalgia as part of the narrative, we can see that as Johnny teaches the next generation how to fight, he sees them and himself making the same mistakes that he'd made in the past. Because he was nostalgic for the way that things used to be, he has fallen into the same traps. Daniel as well is stuck trying to teach the way Mr. Miyagi taught him, but learns that he has to come up with his own tricks to teach his students, ways that will work for him and for them. At the start of the show, we can see that all the pieces are in familiar places, but a little jumbled up. Miguel Diaz occupies the role that Daniel used to, with Johnny in the Miyagi role. Johnny and Daniel have now switched, with Johnny living in Reseda, more poor, and Daniel in the hills as a rich kid. This is fed to the audience in the classic fan service way. Remember when that happened? It's like that but different. Remember when he was the maintenance guy and now it's the other guy? Remember? Wasn't that so great that time? If you liked it then, you'll like it now. Remember? The show expects us to be nostalgic for something, but instead of leaving it at that, it takes the next step and recontextualizes that nostalgia. There are two scenes where Miguel gets the same story of Johnny and Daniel's rivalry, but both scenes are from the other's point of view, conflicting views of the same events. In the 80s, there was always the way things were presented, and that was the hero's story. But Johnny's version is different. It may not be what actually happened, but it's what he tells himself, his narrative. And Daniel has his version in contrast to that. There's no right or wrong, there's only the story that we tell ourselves that happened in the past. And nostalgia is the audience's version of what happened in the past and the story we create around what that means. And this is damaging. The show conveys the message that if we cling to these stories, we are doomed to perpetuate our own actions and possibly pass on their destructive nature to the next generation. Cobra Kai uses the same characters and tropes, but shuffles them around to tell a new story and constantly shows how Daniel and Johnny are not really that different. If they could only get over their own prejudice towards each other, caused by their narrow point of view of the past.
You guys are more alike than you want to admit. And maybe you recognize parts of yourselves in each other, and maybe you don't always like what you see.
The basic message, narratively and thematically, is about nostalgia, and it uses the familiar to recontextualize the events of the movie by having forward momentum and new ideas in the story, rather than relying on the events of the past movies. The more we get of Johnny's backstory, the more we see of how his home life, although opulent, was not one of kindness. His life was complicated, and the militant way of Cobra Kai helped him learn discipline and made him feel strong in his identity. Seeing this makes him a sympathetic character, and it changes the way his actions are seen in the original movie. It recontextualizes the original story. It's not nostalgia, it's changing the way we see Johnny in the source material. That's fucking genius. The show does that a lot with every character that comes back, and it will probably continue to do it with characters that are going to show up. Any character from any movie that Mr. Miyagi was in can be in the show. That is a lot of characters, which includes, no, said I didn't want to talk, no, you shut up. Fine. The next Karate Kid is in the Miyagi-verse, and that means that the writers have entertained the idea of including Hilary Swank's character in the show, and they have been very public about the fact that they are considering it. Most people agree it's not the greatest story and was critically panned, but with everything that Cobra Kai has done to recontextualize the original trilogy, I'm actually excited to see how they might include Julie Pierce as a character, and how they might be able to not just reconcile that movie with the narrative of Daniel and Johnny, but also how that inclusion might change the way we view the next Karate Kid as a movie. It's not even that bad of a movie, other than being mostly the same beats and jokes as the original Karate Kid, but, with what we've seen, the showrunners really understand the material and the audience that's watching it. The way they could handle her story might be what that movie needs to change the way audiences approach the next Karate Kid. I made a joke about not wanting to talk about this movie, but instead of dreading its inclusion, I'm actually excited to see what they might do with it. And I really hope it's more than just a cameo for the sake of fan service. I have every reason to think it will be more than that, based on what the show has done with other returning characters. In its profound understanding of these characters and the meaning behind having its actors return, the respect given to those who cannot return, combined with the presentation of familiarity and the careful rejection and recontextualization of nostalgia, Cobra Kai is the best reboot, or sequel, or remake, or thing that may ever happen because of its unique situation as a new take on a classic 80s themed piece of pop culture. Stray thought time. The actual action scenes in the show are not over the top, but I think this actually works in the show's favor because these are just kids doing karate, not action stars performing amazing moves of martial arts. But when they do have all-out fights, they know how to raise the stakes. That fight at the school at the end of season 2 was crazy choreographed and had an absolutely bonkers climax. I was sweating the whole time. I love a good martial arts movie. Who knows? I might even go back and watch the next Karate Kid again. Maybe. Hey. Thanks so much for watching that video. Strike that like button with no mercy, and remember to leave a comment about what you're excited about for Cobra Kai Season 4. Don't forget to subscribe to catch more awesome episodes of This Is a Thing, as well as our weekly movie podcast, and the long and the short of it. All happening right here on Cinemaster's Ultimate Timeline.